Crisis, and by the way, crisis also implies opportunity, and I'll come to that in a second, is of long time brewing. And the 2008 events were not necessarily when this all began. The consequences of economic integration, which we're now seeing playing out, started about 25 years ago. And so what happened then is, to make that long story short, unskilled workers in poor countries gained at the expense of unskilled workers in rich countries. That's not a 2008 phenomenon. That's like a 1980s and beyond phenomenon. That's what's been playing out, especially in Western Europe and in the US, and to a smaller extent in Canada, much smaller extent, I should say. But that's what the roots of the crisis are. 2008 sort of showed what we've kind of known all along, which is that the institutions and processes to manage globalization had not kept up with globalization. And so that's the second angle there. Two other thoughts on this, because it's you mentioned this again in the opening and in the blurb to the session. Does this mean that there's a crisis in democracy and so on? And my sense is not. Whether we or I or someone likes the results or not, many of the trends we see, be it the Brexit vote or the elections in the US and other countries, they were elections. And they were, for the most part, I mean, there was some rough and tumble, but for the most part, they were legitimate. Interestingly, when you take the data on support for globalization, depending on how you ask the question, of course, support is still quite strong, especially so in emerging economies. There's now a bit of a dichotomy between attitudes to integration in the West, or in the North and the South, but even in the North, it's a question of globalization on what terms. And so that brings me to my final point, is the crisis that leads to opportunity. I think there's room for nation states to assert themselves. There's a lot about managing globalization that does not require multilateral institutions. It would be nice to have functional multilateral institutions, but there are things that we could be doing nationally that we have simply let go by the wayside. One of the issues about this question about technologies replacing jobs and that jobs migrating is that good old-fashioned social policy, social safety nets, retraining programs, skills programs, what used to be called industrial policy. We forgot those things in the dogma, and as a result, industrial countries were unprepared for the transition that they now face. This is not something that a multilateral organization is going to solve. I think this is something that national organizations, national governments can solve. Another example, the whole sort of hue and cry over the fact that immense rents accrue to proprietors of intellectual property and transformative technologies. True, but it is for national governments and nation states to tax those rents and then put them to good social use. Now, there's also a lot of room for multilateralism here. I think we do need some norms around cyber. If we ever got to the stage of taxing robots, it's akin to a Tobin tax. You need a global mechanism to make it work. So yes, there's room for multilateralism, but there's also room for nation states. There's going to be a new compact between those two if we seize the opportunity.